Welcome to the Grief Pod with Venetia Quick. This is a weekly podcast which looks at every aspect of something which has or will at some point affect us all. And that is grief. Whether you've lost a loved one or about to lose someone you know, or perhaps you're simply trying to help someone navigate their grief and don't know where to start or what to say, then perhaps this is the podcast for you. Each week, I'll be bringing you different stories and experiences of loss, love, hope, and at times humour. My guest on this week's episode of the Grief Pod is one of Ireland's, or probably, shall we say Ireland's?
I don't know what you're going to say.
Best known singers, songwriters. You're an author as well.
I am.
And you're a doctor.
I am. I'm a doctor of a DLit, an honorary doctor of the University of Ulster. So it's very funny because I live quite near St James's Hospital, and sometimes on my taxi account it says Dr. Brian Kennedy, right? Because they encourage you to use it, of course.
Yeah.
So they think I'm a medical doctor, but I'm literature and music is what they gave it to me for.
But it's a pretty nice sort of
it's a gorgeous
accolade
thing
to have.
I didn't know what to do with it. I was 39 when they gave it to me. I just released my second novel, I suppose, at that point, or maybe first. And so they got in touch, and I thought to myself, have they made a mistake? Really? But I was so delighted that they honoured me in that way. You know yourself, Venetia, particularly if you're given an honour by the kind of the place where you come from.
Yeah.
It's a very particular temperature of an honour, isn't it? So it was lovely.
Yeah, it's a lovely, I think, acknowledgement, but also because, as you said, it came from where you came from, and where you came from initially.
Oh man,
was
woman. I mean,
as you've described it, a very violent home in
war
a very
zone.
violent place.
A violent home, a violent culture. A war zone, the Falls Road I'm talking about for people listening, in West Belfast, in the worst of times historically. So I was born in 66, so by the time I'm 10 in 76, late 70s, early 80s, we start having internment, we start having the hunger strikes. That's right on our doorstep. You know, I'm from a little area called Beachmount. People want to Google that if they're listening at home. Just off the Falls Road there in West Belfast. So the most incendiary time I could have existed. Now throw into the mix, I'm also a little gay fledgling child, trying to work out maybe what that might be too.
In those days, in that time,
that
in
environment.
the north of Ireland.
A heavy Catholic environment, never mind heavy political environment. British soldiers on every street, all of that stuff going on, people pointing their rifles at me.
You saw somebody being shot.
I saw someone shot a few times, shot dead right in front of me, absolutely. It's the weirdest thing in the world because there's nothing as loud as the sound after the bullet. You think the bullet's loud? It sure is, louder than you think.
It's like the silence.
It's the silence is the loudest part afterwards. And I just wonder, might that be something that is also attributed to grief, which is the idea that, you know, the very loss of somebody is now the presence. You know, the loss is the presence now. So the loudest thing that I sometimes, if I've lost people in my life, oftentimes, really the loudest part about that is their absence, I think.
And it's funny, you know, it is because, you know, it's like the big trauma, the big bang that they're gone, the person's dead, especially if it's something sudden. But then it's sort of the quiet afterwards in that they're not there.
Yeah.
And there's sort of like an eerie sort of, because you're in your own zone, you're in your own little world.
I recorded a song on the most recent record called Man from Mars, and it's about exactly that subject matter where she goes, I hear you in the water and in the wiring in the walls. You know, Man from Mars, this time you've gone too far. It's a Joni Mitchell song. And the first line is, you know, since I lost you, I can't get through the day without one big boo-hoo. Like, it's a funny line, but it's a really beautiful song about grief. When you asked me to do this podcast, I immediately thought about that Joni Mitchell song, Man from Mars, because it is about grief. And then, of course, there's the other grief that I have in my life too, is that I have people now who are gone from my life, but they're still alive.
Yeah, and I was gonna ask you that as well, because obviously absenteeism is something you've talked a lot about, and estrangement and the fact that, you know, people can still be alive but not in your life. So that's a massive grief.
It's a weird walk. It's like a Walking Dead thing. Nearly.
Do you want to take us back to that? Because you had huge estrangement in your life from a very early age.
Yeah, it started very early when I knew, it's the cliche, but I knew I wasn't like the other boys, you know, so I'm from a family of 6 kids, so I'm sort of in the middle. As I always said, my mother had 5 boys and a girl, 4 boys and a girly boy and a girl, you know. And I kind of do sort of stand by that because I wasn't really a boy and I certainly wasn't a girl. So what are you? You know, because in terms of the stringent idea of what boys are, I didn't fit any of those categories. I didn't really want to fight people. I was crap at football, all of those kind of things. The girls were so much more interesting to me because the games were collaborative. They were really supportive of each other and bitchy and all the other things they were. But their games had all these really interesting rules, and I just was more interested in girls, but from a sort of a connectedness, not in any kind of romantic way, really.
But it was a strange time as
It was
well,
a
because
very
I've heard
strange
you
time.
say before on another podcast that, you know, it was a time where you couldn't even be heterosexual.
That's right.
Let
That's right.
alone
I
gay.
mean, try being heterosexual in those times.
Yeah.
Never mind any other kind.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so slowly but surely the pennies started to drop that I was not like other people. But again, one of the things that you know when you're really clever is when you know when to be stupid. And I knew to keep that locked up. I knew from the get-go, do not tell this to anybody. And so you just have to then navigate the Falls Road, the family, the Catholicism, always unscrewing light bulbs. The minute I had a bright thought, I had to immediately unscrew that bulb because it was too bright. It was just too much for the environment I was in. I grew up with a lot of violence inside the house and outside the house. So even no matter where I looked, somebody was being kicked or punched, or at school, in the house. It was very much a kind of a physical punishment situation where people just believed that that was the right thing to do. And for the longest time, I had this problem with language. It's so interesting that my life is centered around my voice and my mouth, because the parent situation happened with me that because I kind of navigated towards girls, I would oftentimes copy what they were saying because I found it interesting and I could connect to it. And so it was basically what the whole point. I love how I'm stumbling now over these words to try and get it out, which is that I was beaten on the mouth every time I used certain words. So the thing was, beat him on the mouth every time he says that word. So they would punch me and beat me on the mouth until my lips bled, until I learned not to say certain girly, in inverted commas, words. Very weird way to grow up, where you just think
it's quite, when you consider the world we live in now.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not great in some aspects,
Yeah.
but where. And I don't want to use the word tolerant, because why should we be tolerant? We should just be accepting.
I mean, can you imagine
know?
doing that to one of your kids, Venetia?
No.
Hitting them on the mouth every time. I'm going to hit you on the mouth until you stop saying that word.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like an alien concept.
Right.
You know.
As it should be.
just-
That's the correct response.
You know.
Yeah.
No, it is. And I mean, I guess as well, just even when I was thinking about this today, the whole idea that for a lot of people living in Dublin,
Yeah.
2 hours, what was going up the road, 2
Yeah.
hours away,
I know.
you can't even.
I still bump into people who say to me, I've never been in the north. Never been to Belfast. Now, of course, as we know, Belfast is unrecognisable.
It's amazing.
One of the greatest places you can visit, actually, and some of the greatest audiences I've ever performed in front of, no doubt. But it's so funny. It's kind of like, The Wizard of Oz. We started off in black and white, and then we went into colour eventually. But that took a long time. I just think that these days, it's so heartening to walk around Belfast if I get the chance to do that, which is not very often. But I do have a black and white movie playing all the time in the back of my head. When I look at a certain street corner, I remember when it was blown to bits. I remember when there was a Saracen on fire, whether there was somebody dead lying there, a bus on fire, I remember all of that very, very acutely. So it's hard for me not to, in my memory bank, first of all, see that first and then see the new Belfast next. And that's a good thing, ultimately.
And it must be quite hopeful as well.
Yeah,
You've come
it is.
sort of in a parallel way to what you grew up in, to getting your doctorship.
Can you believe it? The doctorate. I mean,
You doctorate. That's
but
the
even
word
the venues that I end up playing in, they didn't exist. The Waterfront Hall, where I sold out 2 nights and we made a live album and all that, like that building didn't exist when I was a kid. Nothing existed really beyond and as you know, or maybe not know, especially people listening at home, we literally were ghettoized in the sense that we had a turnstile situation at the bottom of the Falls Road, and we had to queue up like prisoners, be checked out where we were going, and then only then were you allowed through the turnstile and into the city centre. Now, that was the only place that turnstile existed. Didn't exist in any other part of Belfast, just West Belfast. So I remember when Mary McAleese talked about she was talking about on the radio one time about the ghettoisation of Catholics on the Falls Road. People were in uproar. What is she talking about? How dare she say that? It was exactly the same. We were absolutely ghettoised at that point.
From when you came out around 14, 15, is that correct? But that's when you left
to
home.
myself. I left home to live with Granny because that was
Yeah.
a good idea. She was very old in years. She was very unwell. And I suppose I had, without realising it, I did have a very deep empathy for that kind of thing. I was a feminist before I knew it, in the sense that I could see my mother was doing all of these jobs and having to cook and clean for all of us. And really the only other person that was expected to do that was my sister, because she was a girl. And kind of me, because I was in between. I felt it. So if I could see she was exhausted, I'd go, no, I'll do it, Mommy, I'll do it. And none of the other brothers would do that particularly. Obviously, they should speak for themselves, but I'm only going to speak for what I experienced. And so I had a kind of an innate, I suppose, back in the day, the black and white dictionary would say a femininity, rather than a softness or a sensitivity.
Empathy.
And empathy. These days we'd say empathy. You wouldn't say that about a young boy now. But a young boy on the Falls Road in the 70s, it was a bit girly for me to want to help women clean and cook and dust and vacuum and those kind of things. My brothers laughed their heads off at me. Like, what on earth do you think you're doing? I'm thinking,
Wow.
I'm helping our exhausted mother. That's what I'm doing. And I don't mind. I felt her exhaustion. Whereas they were just watching football and sports and I didn't know why they didn't get it. And so I just got into more and more trouble. Then I would challenge Dad and say to him, why don't you stand up and make the other boys do this, that and the other? And I would just get a belt in the mouth, get a punch in the head, or, because I was rocking the boat. I didn't realise it. I just was thinking, what, she needs help.
Yeah, but
Why
you're
isn't
saying
anybody
it as you
helping?
saw it.
I was absolutely living on the outside of myself as well as the inside of myself. And so I have to say as well, there is a grief about that. They talk about older gay men having a kind of a father hunger. I heard that phrase recently enough. And I thought, well, what does that mean? That's interesting. I've done a lot of therapy, of course, over the years. You might be able to tell, possibly. And there is a notion that one of the things about being a young gay person is that, unless it's a very unusual family situation, that you're going to leave that family behind. You're going to leave that environment behind. I had to go and live in a new country in London, in England, and start a new life for myself, get new friends, get a new quote-unquote family, find my tribe if there was one. But the minute I got to London, 18 years old, the first pandemic then I walked right into was HIV and AIDS, because that's what was rife at that time.
And it was highly stigmatised.
Oh my God,
as
still is, I think, probably.
So you've gone through the grief of leaving your family.
Yeah.
Your granny then died.
She then died, so I had nowhere to go.
No one.
Couldn't go back to the house, my parents' house. That was a no-go area. And I'd also tasted a wee bit of freedom, you see, because even though it was a limited freedom, I really, really blossomed being away from that family environment, ironically. When people ask about it now, I talk to my friends about it, and they say, what really was, do you think, if you can sum it up? And I'd say, I just never felt safe. And that's the thing about being in those environments. You either feel safe or you don't feel safe. I never felt safe. So I had to go into the world and create an environment where I thought, yeah, I feel safe. And interestingly, the minute I started to make music and go on stage, that felt safe to me. Isn't that interesting?
So it's sort of like you were using your voice became how you escaped or how you channeled
Absolutely it
your
did.
grief at not having a childhood, really.
Yes.
A childhood every child should expect to have.
Well, I suppose I didn't realise that until much later on in my 20s and 30s, when I'd speak to other people about their childhoods and they'd ask about mine. And I could just see their eyes getting wider and wider. And I'd be thinking, oh, that's probably not very ordinary, is it? I thought my childhood was ordinary because of where I grew up. We all seemed to be kind of going through very similar things in Belfast. So it didn't seem unusual. I looked on the TV. There was a war in another country. There was people being blown up in other countries. So I just thought, well, obviously that's just what the world is like. But it's not like that for lots of people. People don't get beaten on the mouth for using the wrong words or whatever happens after that. It's not usual that their parents might be very physically violent or mentally violent. Now, as we know as well, that is also usual for people in certain parts of the world. But certainly when I went into London and I was surrounded by people from other cultures, I realised, oh no, Brian, I remember when my therapist, I started therapy because I was sad a lot of the time, as well as getting on with my life. I had an unbearable sadness too that I couldn't bear any longer. And so I got psychotherapy at the time. And it was the greatest thing I ever did. But I remember him saying to me, Brian, he goes, normally therapists don't really tell you, they extract from you and you work it out for yourself. But he just said to me, I just want to say to you, it's a miracle you survived any of that, never mind all of it. So I'm like, oh, that's okay. And that's coming from somebody in a position of power and a position of great knowledge, in terms of psychotherapy. So I did tend to kind of go, oh, okay, maybe he has a point. This is not usual. It's not ordinary. And like I say, how interesting to get up on stage. It's no wonder to me that I felt very comfortable within sad songs and all of that. I'm drawn more to sadness in music. So I have to actively shake myself out of that and write Get On With Your Short Life or Life, Love and Happiness, or drawn to Put the Message in the Box, or, up-tempo songs, because I know I can't wallow too long in it. But I do like it. It's like having a warm bath, sometimes you just need to wallow in certain things.
Yeah. Can I just go back to when you went to London in the 80s?
Yeah.
And you were saying
85.
you walked straight from, the Falls Road into to London, which must have been like, it's not like it is now where my 19-year-old, like, he sees a Ryanair flight for 25 quid, he's gone.
I know.
He's there. It's like,
I know, a little taxi. There are air taxis.
Yeah.
Now.
But, that must have been quite a sort of, it would have been an unknown.
Completely.
It's like, it wasn't just like you hop in a plane.
No,
it's like you get the boat
I remember
and
getting
you
my
go over.
dole. It was only 40 something quid, and the ticket, the single ticket to London, was about 38 quid, I think it was at the time. I had to get a bus from the Falls Road out to the international, Aldergrove Airport. It was 2 buses miles away. Bus into town, bus from town out to the airport. So that took hours. And I remember leaving and getting there, and then taking the last flight at night, because it was the cheapest one. Got into Heathrow eventually, then got on the tube, and the tube journey to where I was going in Turnpike Lane was longer than the flight. I remember thinking, how big is this city?
Yeah.
I couldn't get my head around it.
Yeah.
And finally, I did actually then, my eldest brother, who's now deceased, he met me at the tube station, and we walked for about another 20, 30 minutes to a squat that we had just moved into in Tottenham. And that was the start of my life in London.
And the whole HIV epidemic.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
So, obviously, well, you knew people
I did.
who passed away. I know you met Kenny Everett.
I did
ago.
meet Kenny Everett, bizarrely.
One of my absolute
I did.
heroes.
It was such a bizarre moment to meet that man in the Festival Hall in London. And he had been doing a hilarious impression of the Bee Gees called Massachusetts. Remember, and he had big teeth on. And then in walked the Bee Gees into the Royal Festival Hall to meet him.
Oh,
so they were there too. And I ended up opening for the Bee Gees here in Dublin in the RDS.
Wow.
So I had funny little connections with the Bee Gees over the years. And they invited me to their audience with the Bee Gees, and I sat beside their mum in the audience. It was so extraordinary.
Amazing.
I know.
But for something that people didn't understand, people stigmatised, you knew people who died, another grief. But then if you don't get the support from the overall public, in that people were sort of misinformed and sort of generally backed away from...
They thought it was the gay... They called it the gay cancer. That's what it was called. Excuse me, I'm opening bottles of water, people. It was called the gay cancer. It was something that... It was such a... the timing was so awful because I was just beginning to think about being comfortable about being gay. And then suddenly there was this huge punishment doled out, which was, if you are gay, you're going to die of AIDS. It's as simple as that. That's what everybody thought. You could get it off toilet seats. You could get it off a coffee cup. All this misinformation about the virus. And it was the first pandemic I ever encountered. So suddenly, as you say, I knew people socially a little bit, people I'd met in the industry, who were now dead 6 months later. These healthy, happy young men dying of that disease. It was just shocking.
And at times, sort of vitriolic response from people around, like that must have added to this huge
pushed me right back in the closet. Yeah. I mean, I was surrounded by essentially a very Irish environment, which is actually, some people were cool, but most people were very traditional. We'd all get together around Sundays at somebody's house. The girls would do the cooking. The boys would be in the front watching the match and cracking tins of beer. Lots of the boys were on building sites doing their thing. The girls were doing typing or nursing or something. It was very... For having left Ireland to then move to London, I thought, well, I haven't left to live in a mini Ireland in London. I'm not doing that. So I broke out of that pretty quickly. and started to sing with gospel choirs and meet other people. I had loads of Jewish friends. I lived in Stamford Hill at that point, a very, very Hasidic Jewish area. So I just, again, I found myself in an environment I didn't fit in. I still didn't fit. So I had to respectfully know that, it was absolutely a safety blanket in one way to land in London and know Irish people. That was a really good thing and a supportive thing. People were very kind to me. But at the same time, it was also an environment, it was very heterosexual. It was very old-fashioned. I just didn't fit into that. So where do I fit in? And again, I found myself on my own. And that was the time when I left my brother's band because I was a singer in his band. Suddenly, I literally became a solo artiste. I'm on my own. The definition of solo is you're on your own again. And so that's what I did from that moment on, and I've never been anything else.
Your brother, you reconnected with.
I did.
He
and I got cancer in the same year. So it was 2016. We had been estranged for a very, very long time, many decades. Again, it's a difficult thing to talk about, but at the same time, because there isn't enough time really to talk about it. But at the same time, like I say, he grew up with the other granny. I grew up with my other granny. There wasn't even that closeness anyway. It's not like we were best friends and then we had a terrible falling out about one thing. That's not what happened. It was a very gradual disintegration and a realization that we weren't very alike and we weren't very connected other than blood. And he had a very different take on life as I did. He got quite religious at one point and, very disagreeable about what way I was living my life and all that. But, not just those things. It's hard to kind of pin it down. But yes, so we ended up estranged for many decades. Their band did their thing and they got signed. It was like fate was waiting around and going, would you two hurry up and split up?
Yeah.
So as you can be a solo artist and he can be in his band.
Very
and,
successful.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what was going on. And so ultimately, what I would say about estrangement is that it is a very bad habit. It's there's no joy in it really other than relief, other than you're not in a toxic environment. That is a relief. But there's very little joy because you miss out on so much. You're not part of a family. I'm a singer sometimes at weddings, sometimes at other people's family events that they hire me to come and sing at. And what I witness in those situations is the great joy of the glue that happens within a family when one of the daughters gets married, one of the sons gets married, and the family rally round and they put whatever grievances they have aside. Dad gets to be dad, mum gets to be mum, and you see how that works in a family. And I never had that. I never was able to participate in those things. So I certainly there's no joy in that part. But so he was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer in 2016, earlier on. Come the May-June time, I started to feel unwell myself. And I got checked out and long story short, I insisted I get a colonoscopy and they found a tumour then in my body, in my rectum, in fact. And so suddenly I also had cancer.
At the same time.
At the same time. And I knew that his was terminal. Mine was not terminal. And I reached out then via his website because the only way I had to get a hold of him. And his wife was very kind to say, the sooner you see him, the better. He's going downhill very fast. So that's what I did. I drove up. It was like a film. I mean, the day I drove from Dublin to Belfast to meet them, there was some horrific car crash. So the journey that would have taken 2 hours took 4.5 hours. And finally, I got to his house and met with him. And it was such a sad thing in a way because he was very, very unwell. He was on morphine. He kept having to leave the room to do various things and come back. And he was a shadow of his former self. He was, you could see that he was on the ropes of life. He was really not great. And he was, but it was very, very interesting. She left us alone for about 45 minutes, but that was all he could manage because he was so unwell. And we talked about not very much. We didn't go very deep at all. But there was something about it that was really important. I knew it would be the last time I'd see him because he was heading for palliative care. Probably, I saw him in August. That was August, and then he died in the 1st of November in palliative care. So it was a very, very difficult navigation.
Yeah.
That one.
Do you think you've grieved his death differently because you reconnected? Because you'd gone to see him So
Yeah.
perhaps there was that bit of, I don't want to say guilt, but sort of not knowing could something have been resolved and then...
Well, I thought about all of that, of course, and I don't have any guilt about it because what happened happened. You can't really change what happened. And I left for very good reasons, let me tell you. Estrangement doesn't happen on a whim. It happens after many, 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 many sleepless nights and difficult situations and many attempts to reconnect and all those things, especially with the other family. It was important for me to sit with him and see if there was a peace that was possible. How ironic that I come from Northern Ireland and the whole subject of peace about there, and then we have this little private war. And I remember at the end, his wife had said to me, look, he's very sore all over, so don't try and hug him, right? And I went, fine. And so at the end of the 45 minutes, he said, look, I just have to go to bed. I was going, no, fine, I'll head away now. It was just, I'm so glad to get to see you, and thanks for doing that. Thanks for letting me come and see you. And I said, look, it'd be nice to hug you, but I know I can't. He goes, no, let's try. And so and we tried, and he was very fragile. And so at least we did that. And I said, look, going forward, I want, if you can, think of me very peacefully. And any time I hear your music or I think of you, I'm going to think about you really peacefully. There's no darkness about it. It's just really peaceful. So we got to say that to each other.
Which was lovely.
Which was really lovely. And now when I do hear his music, which happens from time to time, I hear him singing on a record or something, I'll just go, oh yeah, there he is. And weirdly, whenever I go to myself, I wonder what time it is. The time is usually 7:10. And that was the name of the band that we were in, the first band that we were in together.
Bizarre.
When I was 16. It's like, oh, of course it's 7:10.
Yeah.
There he is,
Yeah,
so I can have a sense of quietness about that. It's not traumatic at all. Because we did that meeting, I think. Had I not reached out, had I just let it go and then he died, that maybe it'd been a different outcome.
Yeah. You didn't tell him, though, did you?
No.
That you cancer?
About my cancer? Yeah. No, I didn't, on purpose. Because I sort of was talking to his wife briefly. When I arrived, she gave me this very slow tour of the house, and I still hadn't met him for about 10 or 15 minutes. And I thought, okay, so he's building up to it, and he was exhausted in a chair. That's probably why. And so I was sort of thinking about saying it as maybe something we could share, maybe, or something. But very quickly, I realised that was not the right thing to do. This meeting was about him and what cancer he was going through and all of that. So I just wanted the meeting to be about him and about what he was going through. And my cancer was pretty early stages too, even though I knew they kept saying to me, look, it's not terminal what you have, it's very treatable. So I just kept that to myself. And I'm glad I did that because we could focus on what was going on with him.
You also then reconnected with your parents.
Yeah, that was about a year after he died. And I'd been doing some, for my own, before I finally bowed down to full modern Western medicine and had the 9-hour surgery and the 2 stomas and all this, I did, with one eye on oncology, look at other healing ways and like a herbal journey and all the things that you would expect somebody like me to consider.
Well, it's also very, look at the Netflix show, apple cider vinegar. People believe, but and the keto diet.
I was being sent emails from one of the only downsides and upsides of being in the public eye a little bit is that people were saying, do not do chemotherapy, do not, all these, lots of emails about that. Other people saying, look at a herbal thing. Other people saying, ignore all that, go straight to, oncology, blah, blah, blah. So I had the full gamut of everything. And I told my oncologist what I was doing. Like, I didn't hide it. And I just said, look, I'm looking at alternative. And I said, you just keep telling me. Every time I had a scan, they said, look, the tumour hasn't travelled anywhere. It hasn't metastasized, but it's very low down. And I thought that was a good thing in the rectum. But actually, because it was attached to the muscle wall, it meant that the muscle would never really work properly again if they cut into it, which is what they had to do to remove the tumour. So in other words, really, ultimately, what they were saying is, we're going to have to remove your rectum. That's going to have to happen. And what that means is you end up with a colostomy bag, and in my case, a urostomy bag also. Yeah. So poo and pee. Yeah. On a complete
or as you described it, I heard, you're double bagged.
My double bags, that's right, my twins. That's right. The taxi driver in Dublin referred to me as a bag ambassador.
A bag for life.
Yeah, exactly.
So that, obviously, you're looking at your own you know, your health, your
and mortality.
Yeah,
for
you know,
sure.
especially, and I think if you've somebody close to you that has died, particularly suddenly or after a short illness, you become a little bit you become very aware of your own health, your own mortality, you know, maybe slightly bit of a hypochondriac to some degree in that, like, oh, I have a pain here.
Oh,
what
for
could that
sure.
be?
Even these days, if I get a certain amount of pain, because the thing about it is, if something does happen to me and I think, oh, well, like, for example, not that long ago, my stool went very dark. And I thought to myself, what is that? So because I'm on a whole connection to colorectal cancer, and also these days quadruple heart bypasses, which I had 3 years after that because of the schooling, is that the chemo kind of wrecked my heart muscle. And so I ended up having a massive heart attack at home, and then that needed a quadruple heart bypass 3.5 years ago, nearly 4 years ago. So once you're in that kind of area, I'm duty bound to myself and to my history to call up, the oncology and say, look, what is this? I've suddenly noticed that the stool is a lot darker. And so they come in, come straight in. You do all the bloods again. You do everything. Now, it was all clear. It was just an infection I had and different things. But the worry always is, is it back? Is it turned around? You know. So unfortunately, everything has that weight about it all the time. But it's better to know than not to know. And so that's what I do. I don't ever leave. I mean, fortunately and unfortunately, I know A&E in James's very well, because anytime I ever had anything that worried me, it was sore enough to go over to A&E during the night.
You walked to A&E with a heart attack.
I did. Let me just, the context of that is that I live relatively close to James's, so it could be a walk. And it was about a 15-minute stagger, I would say, about 2 o'clock in the morning, because I'd just experienced this pain that I'd never experienced in my life before on the right side of my body, not on the left side, not down my left arm like all those other people tell you. It was a right-handed thing. I had terrible stomach acid for ages, couldn't get rid of it, stomach pains, out of breath all the time walking. I'd suddenly gained some weight. Very weird things were happening to my body, and I thought it was lockdown. I thought it was I wasn't really going to the gym anymore because of lockdown. I was probably drinking a bit too more regularly, eating a bit too much. I put it down to all those things. But in fact, one night I just had the weirdest pain, and I very unlike me, I got scared. And I thought to myself, thank God I didn't have any sleeping pills in the house, because I remember thinking to myself, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, it's Friday night. I'm not going to A&E, it'll be packed full of people. Maybe I'll just take a sleeping pill and get up in the morning and go over if it's still sore. That would have been the worst thing I could have done. I would probably never have woken up, because then what happened is I thought, no, Brian, that's a very bad idea. I didn't even look for a sleeping pill. But I lay down and the pain got worse. And I thought, oh no. And I was getting dressed, going out the front door as I was thinking, walking over, staggering over to A&E, because as we know, that the new children's hospitals is still being built at this point, as even now. But even then, it was a wee bit more of a building site, so I had to negotiate pretty uneven pathways and mucky pathways, and to get into the back of A&E there. And so once I got in, I just said, look, there's something wrong. There's something really wrong. And they took one look at me and went, okay, come on in. And they eventually hitched me up to the machine. And then the curtains came around the bed. She goes, you're having a massive heart attack.
Wow.
That's the word she used.
Did you see your life flash
no, I
in
didn't.
front?
I
or
remember
was it like,
just thinking,
I'd be grand?
What? I couldn't believe it. But at the same time, I'd been over 6 months before with chest pains, and they had said to me, look, what's been flagged in your scan is that you've got calcification of the main artery going into your heart. That's something that comes with age. It's possibly something to do with chemo. They were not very clear about it. But I'll never forget, they said to me, I want to assure you, there's nothing going on with your heart. That's what they said.
Wow.
And then, so maybe at that point there wasn't. That's because they did all the same tests and I was fine. And then in terms of the heart situation, the cardiology department then called me 2 weeks before and said to me, I've been looking at all, because we couldn't have a meeting because of COVID. It was all on the phone. He said to me, look, I'm looking at all your notes and I know about the calcification. I know this is going on. But he said to me, let's do a full body thing in about 5 years. Right? 2 weeks later, I have a massive heart attack. And then when he finally came around to see me, a couple of days after the actual operation, I just looked at him and I said, well, this is awkward, isn't it?
We're to very fast
Like-
forward 5 years.
Because when I was brought in, they said to me eventually the next morning, they kept me awake and everything. They just said to me, Brian, your heart muscle is working at 30%. So we can't do anything at this moment. We have to hope that your heart muscle will get stronger in order for us to, she goes, I need to do quadruple bypass. One of your arteries is completely blocked. And I was going, but how? I'm not a mad drinker. I'm not a smoker. I'm not any of those things. And she just goes, so that's what, but thankfully within 48 hours, my heart muscle had come back to 40% and all that. And finally they were able to do and the great news is I had an MRI on my heart not that long ago, because I had to have surgery on my sinus, ladies and gentlemen, not long ago, and my heart muscle was up to 67%. So it's improved hugely since, because I'm taking all the right medication.
And looking after yourself.
And really looking after myself as much as I can. Absolutely.
This all springboarded then the reconciliation of sorts.
Well, so a year and a half later, I was doing the therapy. And one of the things the therapist said to me, she said to me, listen, what do you think about trying to reach out to your parents? What do you think about that? Because you've done it with your brother, and that was a good thing. What about? And I thought, well, and I'd heard that my mother had already started a journey with Alzheimer's, so that was going on. And she was, pretty bad with it and getting lost in the area, and all sorts of things were going on. And my dad, the same thing. They're pretty old at this point. So I was very lucky that I have one brother who I'm very good friends with. And I said to him, is there any way we could set up a meeting at your house, somewhere neutral?
Yeah.
And so that's what we did. And they came around on the day. And she had no idea who I was at all. It was extraordinary. Wow. So Stuart brought them in, and I'd forgotten how small they were. They're very tiny people. And I hadn't seen them for many years now. So in they came, and my mother was in the grip of Alzheimer's, so she wasn't really sure where she was. Certainly, she kept saying to me things like, are you married, love? Are you married? No, I'm not married. No, and where do you? I live in Dublin. You live in Dublin, do you? And then she'd look at the TV and laugh her head off about something on the TV. And then eventually kind of talk about things that weren't related to us sitting there. And Dad was sitting quite nearby. And I would say, so are you, he was an athlete, and I'd say, so are you still running? How's the running going? Knowing full well that he had stopped running many years, because he was in his 80s at this point. And I got very little out of him. He wasn't as far down. It turns out he was also heading for Alzheimer and land, and he'd begun that, and I didn't quite realise that. And so he was quite unresponsive, wouldn't look at me at all.
Oh, really?
Yeah, really wouldn't look at me.
Do you regret going back there, or do you feel it sort of has given you closure and sort of full circle?
Yeah, yes, in a way it did, because when they left again after about 45 minutes, because it was just kind of pointless. It was, there was no connection at all. And fine, because my brother Stuart would say, Mommy, do you know who this is? And she'd go, of course I do. Who is he? I'll tell you later. She kept saying to him. And then finally, when he brought them back, she said to him, who was that fella, the tall fella with the lovely hair? That tall fella with the lovely dark hair. Who is he? And Stuart would go, that's Brian, Mummy. And who's he? Like not even a flicker of anything. And so Stuart came back then, and it was like, so, wow, that was something, wasn't it?
How did you feel?
I just felt really, as you say, it was certainly a closure of some kind, a definite shutting of something, because that was the very last possible attempt to say, well, look, I'm here, and I wanted to say sorry that you lost your first child, and Bap had died a year before, and all that. And yeah, it felt very empty. I felt very empty. I got back in my Jeep and drove back to Dublin, just kind of on the motorway going, right, that happened. Okay.
Is that closure then in your past life? Have you grieved maybe your past life, and now you're moving into, or have moved, obviously?
Yeah, I think I did that a long time ago. Honestly, I think I don't want to sound dramatic at all, but I think there was a death of some kind a very long time ago in that relationship. And it was just more concrete proof of just the impossibility of it, of there being any kind of resolution, any kind of reconnection. Because they were gone. Now, since Dad has died, he died a couple of years ago, she's still alive and in a home. And I believe, I don't know much about it because it's a painful thing, I
Yeah.
think, probably for my brother to discuss with me, because he has a relationship with them and with her. So I think that, as far as I understand, it's just about being heavily medicated, and the day will come when that won't work anymore, and I presume she'll pass away at some point. But she'll be 85 this year. He was 84, nearly 85 when he died a couple of years ago. So it is a very bizarre thing to have as an adult when I'm around other people, and it's only natural to ask about family, to ask about parentage, and what do you do for Christmas? What do you do for your birthday? Did you hear from such and such? No, I don't know any of those things. I don't know what it's like to come from a family like that. So when I spend time with other people and sometimes I might be in a family situation at Christmas time, somebody else's family, and very well-meaning, gorgeous friends of mine. And there's a grief in that, because you really don't belong there. And the only reason that you're there is because you don't have a family of your own. That's the only reason you're there. So you have to come to terms with that, and make it fun and make it easy. And every year I do something different that's fun and easy and pleasant, because it is a choice in the end. I think sometimes...
Well, perhaps because you have the choice now, whereas when you were younger,
Yeah,
you had
you
no
don't.
choice.
I think one of the sentences that I heard that resonated with me was, my grief is that I have no grief. That's what it feels like sometimes, where I realised that I had parents, that I had siblings, but I don't have them. And so my grief is that I have no grief about it anymore. It's just one of those things that it is what it is. And because somebody is blood related does not mean that they have any kind of access to you or your life now. And it's been so long now, I have siblings that live in other countries. There's only one sibling that's passed away. That's the eldest fella, Bap, who was the only other musician in the family. So, it's a very unique, I'm looking at your sign, unique media. It's a very unique place to be, I think, where I am.
But it's almost like you've had two lives now, because you're hugely successful. You had your 18th album. It's like complete contrast between...
Well, thank God for the work. I don't know what I'd do without the work. And I think lots of other relationships of mine have really suffered because of my attention to my work. And I think that I would not necessarily have been able to give that artistic attention had I had a regular life, a regular relationship. It's really affected my other relationships. I have some old friends of mine. Also, an old school friend of mine died a couple of years ago from brain cancer, and we had been estranged also for a number of years, and we grew up together. It was very painful. And I have a friend of mine who's alive, who's my childhood friend, but he has decided to end our friendship and doesn't want to be friends anymore. And that was quite a long time ago. And when I had announced my cancer, he got in touch and we met up. And that was the time that he told us our other friend had brain cancer, and the brain cancer fella has since died. He was only 50 when he died.
Wow.
And so I've had a lot of loss, an awful lot of loss for one person. When I got my first year cancer-free diagnosis, which was a great time of supposed joy, within that week, our lovely friend Danica McGuigan, Barry McGuigan's daughter, died of cancer very suddenly after 5 weeks only, and I found myself singing at her funeral. I grew up... I've known that family for 28 years. She was 3 or 4 when I first met her. She lived at my house in Dublin when she was studying acting.
Wow, she's beautiful.
A gorgeous woman, and 33 when she died, only of cancer. And so I found myself, even though I had a joyous 1 year free, cancer-free, I couldn't again share that because I was going to a really difficult funeral and I sang at the Mass, and then we went to the cremation in England. And to be around again a family that were such a beautiful, connected, normal, healthy family, to then see them devastated by the loss of their only daughter, and to be part of the soundtrack of that, that was so difficult. Because again, isn't it interesting, that anytime I've had really superly brilliant news, I can't really announce it. I can't really... sometimes I have to unscrew that light bulb that I was talking about earlier. I can't shine too bright sometimes in those circumstances. I have to choose my moment. Like when I was first diagnosed with cancer, I didn't tell anybody. That day, I went out to dinner with my closest friends, women friends, for margaritas and dinner. And I had cancer for the first time in my life
you said
that day.
nothing?
I said nothing. Nothing. Not a word. Drank some margaritas.
I wonder, does that stem from where you came from and being afraid of saying things?
I think there's no wonder about it. I think it's exactly what it is. I think it's exactly right. And then when I got myself together, I wrote a collective email to the closest people in my life and connected them all to it. And I called it Tumour Humour and wrote an email saying, look, I'm sorry to say I've been diagnosed with a tumour. It's early days. They tell me it's treatable. I just want to let you all know in one email. I don't want to keep having to repeat this. Get in touch if you want, whatever you want to do. But just, I'm not a person for drama. Keep the drama on the stage and all that. And that's how I dealt with that. And I suppose there's a grief about that too, isn't there?
There is.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're very resilient.
Robust.
And I don't like the word resilient generally.
Yeah,
because
I'm robust, I would say.
Thrown around. But you are, you must have a very good mindset, like a very strong mentality to get
what are the
through.
choices there?
I know, but it's...
I know whether we're not supposed to be talking about you as well, but you're also like that, aren't you? When you lost your fella?
Yeah, but at the same time, I suppose you see it in other people more than you see it in yourself.
Totally. I don't think of myself as particularly robust or particularly strong, but I'd be a fool to not look at the evidence and go, oh God, you must be. Even as far back as leaving Belfast with a fiver in my pocket to go and live in the centre of London, like how many Irish lads before me and after me with a bit of a dream to be a singer. I mean, for goodness sake, the massive naivety of it, but that's part of the petrol and that was part of the success of it, because you have to almost be hugely naive for spectacular things to happen sometimes.
Finally, is there anything that would make you feel completely complete? That this whole chapter of your childhood at this point has closure?
I'm not sure that that's entirely possible, because when it happens to you very young like that, all of that loss and all of that damage, it's something that I look at it like it's a kind of a big, beautiful canvas. In the corner of that canvas, early on when I started the painting, there was a lot of damage, and there's a lot of holes in the canvas, and there's a lot of stuff that's not really that repairable. But what I've done is I've done a much larger painting, and a big colourful painting, a gigantic thing. And only if I tell you to look at the far right corner where the damage is, that's where you locate it. But hopefully what you're distracted by is all the other blossoming that I did. So the bigger picture, the bigger painting that I've painted is far outweighs the damage. So in other words, it's always still there. It's like a kind of an old tattoo, it's still sort of faded and there. It'll never go away. But it's not the biggest part of my skin. It's not the biggest part of my story. And so I would just respectfully say, fair fox to you if you're able to just completely blank that stuff out and get on with your life. I'm sure some people can do that. I have a sort of respect for it, because it has made me into the man that I am. The only thing I haven't succeeded at is relationships with romantic relationships. I've never succeeded at that so far. I mean, I'm 59 this year.
Sure look,
yeah. So certainly
60s where it's at.
Apparently, so I'm so looking forward to my 60s, because 50s were really hard with all of the health things.
Yeah.
But 60s I'm looking forward to. And
look at Demi Moore.
Exactly.
There you go.
Exactly. There you go.
Brian,
so,
thank you.
Venetia, a joy to speak to you. Thank you for asking me
much
to come and speak about grief.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Grief Pod with Venetia Quick. You can listen on SoundCloud or wherever you get your podcasts. We also have an online community on Facebook, The Grief Pod, or on Instagram @GriefPod Series.